Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to create some Jack of all trades cards using the new Jack of all trades collection from Spellbinders and Jaycee Gaspar. So this first die here is called the Reversible Royal Court. This one here is called Kaleidoscope Noble Suits die set. And I love the fact that you can stack them all together or you could use them on their own. Then we have the Pip Rank die. I've got one, the diamond is missing. I'm using it for one of the cards and I wasn't sure if I was going to use it again. Next we have the Enchanting Suits Facets press plate set, and then the Deluxe deck press plate. I absolutely love this. It's such a gorgeous background. Works perfectly with all of the things in this collection, but would also work great as a background for other things as well. So it's not only suited for this collection. I think it's going to be a fabulous one that gets used over and over. And then we have the Shuffling Sentiments press plate. This one has a ton of different sentiments, perfect for card game themes or cards with card game themes, if that makes sense. I'm going to use a few of those sentiments in several of my cards today. So I have all of my pieces organized in my medium craft stacks, and I have my magnetic panels in there. You just saw how strong those magnetic panels are. I have this larger heart press plate here, and when it's on that magnetic panel, even if I am shaking that craft stacks, it doesn't fall out. So it's a great way to organize, store your things as you're creating. For my first card, I am using the BetterPress with this heart press plate, and I'm using BetterPress cardstock. I am using some pink champagne interference ink, and I'm going to be using this a couple times throughout the video. It's going to have pink on light cardstock, but it's going to have that little bit of a green shimmer when you tilt it in the light. And on dark or black cardstock, it's going to have that green interference to it. So for my background, I just wanted a very simple pressed image. I wanted it different than the die cuts that I had already cut out, a little bit of a different pink shade. So I put that in the center of my cardstock, putting it up a little bit so I have a space for my sentiment below it. For my mat, I cut that down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and I'm just using that pink champagne interference pad to go around the edges. This is going to just show up around the edges of my heart piece, and so I don't need to put ink on the entire thing. That's kind of a waste of ink. I only put it around the edges that we're going to be showing. For my heart image here, I'm just taking 1/4 inch off of each side of my piece of cardstock. So it's going to end up being 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. My plan for this card is a very, very simple design. This collection is perfect for card-themed cards, playing card-themed cards, but I wanted to share a few ideas of ways you could use it without having that playing card theme. So I have that Kaleidoscope Noble Suits die set. I have the hearts from that die set, die cut out of some pink sand cardstock and some Hero Arts Azalea and Plum cardstock. So I wanted each layer to have a different color of cardstock. Because I have some of that interference ink on my glass surface, I didn't want it to go to waste. I wanted to fill in the background a little bit to tie all the colors in, but I also didn't want a lot of inking on there. I didn't want to do some ink blending and have the focal point pull away from my heart, so I just did a little bit of splatter. I used my Mighty Mister to just make that ink a little bit more liquid, and then use my Yasutomo brush to just splatter it over the background. So that's going to have a pink splatter to it, and it's going to have just a tiny bit of that green shimmer to it when you tilt it into the light. I had a little bit of ink build up there on my mat, so I just rubbed the excess off so I didn't accidentally have some of that ink bleeding through the front of my card. Glued those both in place and put an acrylic block on there just to hold that down while I'm stacking my die cuts here. Now, one of the die cuts, the middle one cut with the Azalea cardstock, I did put that pink champagne interference ink over top of it just to tie in the colors a little bit more. It's kind of a medium tone cardstock, so we're not going to really see that pink tone coming through because the dye part of that ink is going to just blend and coordinate or blend with that cardstock, but it is going to give that little bit of interference shine. So when you tilt the card into the light, you're going to have a little bit of a shimmer in that middle stacking there. I did ink my sentiment too while I was at it, and once that was completely dry, I put that onto the bottom of the card. Now, when I was assembling my die cuts, I must have had a little bit of that interference ink on top of my finger. I got a little bit of a smudge on that top die cut. You probably couldn't even really see it much on the video, but I wanted to have a nice clean die cut on top, so I cut another one off screen and just glued that right to the top of it. It made the stacking a little bit deeper, but that's totally okay. I just wanted to make sure that to have a pristine heart on the top of there. For my next card, I'm going to do a very, very similar design to that first one, but we're going to use the clubs or the clovers for this. So I have my cardstock here, or my clubs die cut out of Peridot cardstock, some Hero Arts Kiwi cardstock, and some Hero Arts Pesto cardstock. And I'm going to do 2 of the clubs or clovers for this one. The reason I keep saying clubs or clovers is for the card deck, it would be clubs, but for the design that I'm creating, clovers makes more sense. And it will make more sense as I get the card finished. So I want my stacking all glued together. So I'm going to stack them up, putting them under the acrylic block to hold them nice and flat while I'm gluing the next layer. And then I can tuck that to the side while I'm working on the focal part of my image. I have Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle, and that's what I use to glue most things together when I'm card making. Using a liquid glue gives you the ability to just move things around and shimmy things in place before that glue starts to hold. And you don't need to use a lot of glue, and it typically will start holding fairly quickly. So it's a great economical way to be assembling your cards. Obviously, there's a few things that don't work well with liquid glue, and when that happens, I will alternate adhesive for what works best. But for most things, especially when it's gluing cardstock down, liquid glue is perfect. So I'm going to use the club part of that Enchanting Suits Facet press plate set, and I'm centering that in the middle of the 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch markings on the base of my BetterPress. I'm using some crushed olive distress ink to ink that press plate, and then I'm going to put the clear plate on the base and run it through my Platinum 6 machine. This is going to press that ink onto my BetterPress cardstock and transfer that image. Now, I didn't get a whole lot of ink in that center of that press plate, so I'm going to do this again. Now, when you have a BetterPress system, if you don't tape your gray plates in place, there's a chance they might shift. You can see that I have yellow tape around that gray mat, and that's to hold it in place to make sure that when I do something like this and I have to do something a second time, I know that my plates aren't going to shift, and I know that my image is going to be exactly where I wanted it to be for that particular image. So that's why I have that yellow tape around the gray area for my press plate. So when I have instances like this, I know that I can just ink my plate again, making sure that to be careful not to move my plate, and then I can run it through again. And the reason I say not to move my plate is for an instance like this where I'm doing some sentiments. Those are really tiny plates and they're really easy to move. Like it takes very little pressure to move them around the base of that BetterPress. Bigger plates are going to be a lot stronger and going to hold a little bit better, but smaller plates like this, you have to be really careful because they will easily move. I'm doing some sentiments right away. I want to have the Lucky You sentiment for this club or clover card. And I also wanted some sentiments for my future cards here, the other 2 that I'm going to create in this video. So I figured I might as well do them at the same time. I'm not using BetterPress cardstock for that. I'm just using some Hammermill cardstock. I didn't feel that I wanted to use BetterPress and then waste the excess from it. So, and Hammermill was going to do what I wanted it to do for the cards that I was creating. So I carefully put those on my BetterPress plate. I used the BetterPress ink for the center sentiment, the crushed olive ink for the Lucky You sentiment for this particular card, and then that pink champagne interference ink for the other sentiment for my 4th card in this video. While talking about this, I trimmed down my mat that was from the Pesto cardstock to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches, and then trimmed down my club or clover piece here to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. Now I'm going to glue on those club or clover die cuts. And I'm just putting these all to the center of my card. You could have, or I could have done a similar thing to my last card and put that image piece a little bit higher and then put my sentiment below it. But for this particular one, I wanted to put my sentiment right across those clubs or clovers. So for this one, I'm using that Lucky You sentiment. I figured it worked really well for kind of a St. Patrick's Day theme. It could be for something else too, but I figured that's kind of what I had in my mind when I was creating this. Again, trying to find ways to use this collection that aren't just playing card themed cards. So I use my guillotine trimmer to trim that sentiment down, and then I'm just using my detail scissors to just cut a little notch out of either end to create a more interesting end to that sentiment than if it was just cut straight with my guillotine trimmer. Then I'm going to use that Barely Art glue, and I'm just going to glue that in the center of those clubs or clovers. Now, while that was drying, I noticed that there is a round circular piece die cut out of the center of that club or clover, and I thought it would be a great place to put one of these Crystal Mix gems. So I'm putting them in each one of the center holes. Probably should have done this before the sentiment before putting that sentiment down, because that one to the right does go a little bit under that, but my sentiment hadn't dried enough to hold it in place, so it was really easy to lift it up, slip that gem in, and then put the sentiment right back down. Because I have that gem there, I thought it would be nice to put a few scattered around the outside of the card. So when I do this, I will typically do larger ones closer to my focal point, and then smaller ones towards the outside. And I do find using a die pick to pierce into the adhesive behind those gems and then place them on the card makes it work really, really easily. For my third card, I'm going to once again use that Kaleidoscope Noble Suits die. I'm using the diamonds for this, and I have them die cut out of some black cardstock, and I thought it would be interesting to use these diamonds as a background for my card rather than just layering them on top of each other. I still used all three of the diamonds, so I have some that are going to be a thicker black, some that are going to be thinner, and I figured that would add a little bit more interest to my background. I'm also using the Reversible Royal Court die. I'm going to use that for the focal image for the front of my card, but I'm going to create the background first. So I started with one of the die cuts, putting it in the center, trying to be as straight as possible and keep it as centered as possible, but I also know that I do plan on trimming this piece down. I'm gluing this onto a piece of Hammermill cardstock that's 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. But once I have my background completed, I want my finished piece here to be 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. So there's a little bit of wiggle room, a little bit of leeway. Then I choose 4 of the die cuts that are the same and glued them to the points of the center die cut. And I try to make sure to only put glue on the part that's going to be on the Hammermill cardstock. Anything that's going to be hanging off, I tried not to put glue on there. It's going to not be an issue if I did. I can easily clean that off of my glass surface, but it's always easier to try to avoid that, not waste the glue and not have to clean it up, than not paying attention and wishing that I had done that. So with those 4 on the points of the diamond, I can take one of my thinner die cuts, and I'm going to fill in just those areas between, well, you can see where I'm filling in. So by using all of the same die cuts, I'm kind of getting an even all over pattern to this. Another option would just be to use the same die cut it. I think I did 4 for each one of these die cuts, so I have 12 die cuts altogether. So if you wanted to do the background with all the same die cut, you could cut that 12 times. Probably could do it a couple less and use some scraps if you wanted to. But like I said before, I thought it's just more interesting to have some that are a little bit thicker, a little bit thinner, and it just gives it a little bit more visual interest. So I'm left with 3 extra die cuts here, or 3 die cuts here. This is the same die cut that I put in the center of my card. I'm going to glue those 3 down, and then I'm going to use my shears to trim off the excess. And because I'm trimming off the excess, once I've done that, I will have another piece to use on that bottom right corner. So I don't have to die cut an extra one. It just means that I have to be careful and pay attention to which ones I'm die cutting from those corners, so that I have the same one to die cut glue in that other corner. So once I have those done, I can put those extra pieces to the side. There's a few points of the diamonds that I can put on the top and the bottom that I will fill in. I am going to fill them in simply because I'd rather them be there and trim them off. But once this is completely trimmed, you see barely any of it. So this is probably a step that really could be avoided. You're only going to see the very tip of a couple of the diamonds. so that, you know, I'm just going a little bit overboard here. At this point, I wasn't too sure exactly how much of that was going to be showing. And in the end, there's just a tiny little point of a couple of the diamonds. I think it's on the top that end up being part of the card. So without that, if there was just a little opening there without anything glued down, I don't think anyone would even notice. But with those glued in place, once that glue has held, I can trim that down and put the excess pieces of those in the garbage because they're pretty much cut up. I can't think of anything I'd want to use them for. So now that my background there is done, I'm ready to trim it down. So width-wise, I want my final width to be 3 3/4 inches. So I am taking the center of that diamond, centering it or lining it up on my trimmer with the 1 7/8 mark. And then when it comes to my length, I want the finished length to be 5 inches. So I am lining that center mark of that center diamond to the 2.5 inch mark. And that's the easiest way to do it, to try to make sure that that pattern is centered as much as possible. Now, this is where I had that diamond die. I'm not sure if I want to use the diamond on my background. In the end, I don't end up doing it, but when having this idea in my head, I thought maybe some diamonds in the background might fit in. For when my piece is complete, I feel that there's enough going on that it doesn't need that. But if you wanted to, you could create this background and just use it as a background, just put a sentiment on it for, say, a masculine card, just something a little bit different. You don't necessarily have to put another image on there. I think it's just a really kind of cool background that looks different and unique. However, I do plan on putting this king as a focal point on the front of the card. So I have the parts of his outfit die cut out of onyx cardstock, crimson cardstock, as well as some brushed gold cardstock from the Gold Treasured cardstock pack. I also have his face die cut out of Barely Peach cardstock and his hair die cut out of some latte cardstock. On the front of the die, there is he's holding some different type of weapon. I don't know what it's called, but I wanted him to hold the sword, so I have the blade of the sword die cut out of some matte silver cardstock. So as I'm putting these little pieces together, I am putting them under that acrylic block just to hold everything nice and flat while it's drying. You'll especially need this for those metallic pieces simply because they like to curl once you put glue on them. But by putting them under the acrylic block, it helps keep them nice and flat, and it frees up your hands to be working on other things. And you can see that as I'm layering them together, I'm moving back and forth between the different pieces. So I'm not gluing everything onto one, creating a completed piece and then moving to the next one. I'm just kind of going back and forth, letting the glue sit and start to bond a little bit before adding extra pieces. And I have all my pieces in another medium craft stacks here. So I have them all organized, ready to go, and I know they're all in one place while I'm creating. So it keeps them nice and organized. And having my glue in a bottle with a nice fine tip to it means I can assemble even the most intricate of die cuts with that glue, as well as assembling my cards together. So it comes in handy. I don't have to grab different glue bottles. I grab the same one and I use it for everything. So when it comes to this reversible Royal Court die set, there is a lot of pieces to each one of these figures, but part of the fun with all of those pieces is it gives it such a unique and interesting look. It adds so much more detail. So the hardest part of this is die cutting all of those pieces. The assembly, you can see, comes together fairly quick and easily, and I will often, especially when there's a ton of die cuts, have the die sitting to my side so that I can reference it while I'm assembling things, making sure that I get them exactly where either the die intends or where I want them to be. Sometimes the die will have them going a certain place and I decide that I want them positioned a little bit differently. That's totally fine. But it's nice to have that reference so that I can make sure that I'm not missing a step. And for me, I will often miss a step because I'm not necessarily paying attention. So I kept the color palette for this particular card very similar to playing cards. I kept it white, black, and red, and I love these colors together with that gold. You could do whatever color combination you want. If you wanted to change those colors up, it would look fantastic as well. And again, I'm not creating a playing card with this. I'm just kind of getting a little bit creative with these dies. So you don't necessarily, even if you're using the traditional color palette for playing cards, you can still get creative with it. And I'm positioning that sword so it's not in front of his face. I want it in front of his body, but not covering part of his face. Once that has completely dried, I can put it onto my background here. And this is where I decide that I don't want to add those diamonds to the background. I think it's going to take away from the figure on the front. So I just put those pieces aside and I'm ready to get my sentiment together. So this die set, the sentiment die set, has a die to it. The sentiment press plate set has a die to it that you can create a banner. So I'm positioning those dies in place, taping them so that they don't move on me. The piece at the bottom, I don't necessarily need to tape that, but I want to make sure that it fits within that cardstock and it's not going to move and overlap with my other die set. So once I have that done, I can put that through my die cutting machine and cut those pieces out. Now this banner is unique to any other banners that I have created. Normally when I've used banner dies, you just glue the little ribbon pieces underneath it. It took me a few moments to figure out why my angles were wrong and why they weren't fitting. This one, you fold that scored edge. There's a line on that piece of cardstock that gets cut for the ribbon ends, and you fold that and then glue that fold on. And the cool part about that is it also gives it a little bit of extra dimension by doing it that way. So it's a really unique way for this banner die to be made, and it creates a really unique look to it. So once I have that glued in place, I have some sewing clips and I'm just putting them on there just to hold that in place while that glue is setting and drying, and it really only takes a moment or two. Once that has set and dried, I'm ready to assemble my card. I chose a piece of crimson cardstock for my mat. This is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. A piece of brushed gold cardstock would also look fantastic here and would frame it off really nicely. I'm running low on my brushed cardstock, so I want to make sure that I have enough for die cutting little pieces, so I chose that crimson instead. Then I glued down my diamond background and then my sentiment here. I want to make sure that my sentiment has that same angle as the bottom of that reversible royal court figure die set. It's going to give it, once again, a little bit more of a unique look. And then I do kind of overlap the shield of that die cut over top of that sentiment, once again, for a little bit more of an interesting look to it. For my fourth card, I wanted to get creative in a different way. I'm going to use the Deluxe deck press plate for the background of my card. And the idea of this card was inspired by Wicked. A few days before creating these cards, I had seen an advertisement for a deck of cards that were Wicked themed, where they had Glinda for the hearts and the diamonds, and they had Elphaba for the spades and the clubs. And I thought it would be interesting to create an image that had both of them in one because of the angle on the bottom of the bodies. I thought it'd be fun if it kind of joined the two together. So that is the inspiration behind this card. What I want to do is create a background with that pink champagne interference ink. Because the interference part of it is green, it's going to work perfectly for this idea. And I also want to use some black ink on the background here so that it shows off some of that interference color. So the black ink is also going to coordinate well with the black from Elphaba's gown as well as her hat. So I ink it on an angle to kind of coordinate with the angle that the bodies have at the bottom of them. And then I use an ink blending brush just to buff out that line a little bit. I want to have a nice blend between the black and the white. I don't want any harsh lines there. So that worked out perfect. Now, before I do the next step, I want to clean some of that excess black ink. So I have a damp microfiber cloth here. It looks like I'm being rough, but I am actually wiping it very gently with no pressure. I want to make sure that that press plate does not move at all. And then I'm taking that pink champagne interference ink and I'm inking that entire press plate up. I'm trying to be very light with it. I don't want to press that ink into the grooves of this press plate. When you're working with these interference ink with the press plates, the pad is a foam pad, so it is very, very spongy. I want to make sure that I'm only inking the raised part. Sometimes when you ink it and you press too much in there, you'll get some ink transfer from the recesses of that press plate. So I'm trying to be very careful to only ink the top of it, then put the clear plate to the base and then put it through my machine, and there is the result. Now that was pressed on BetterPress cardstock. You could do it on any cardstock that you want, but I wanted to get that pressed image in there. And I took a corner rounder and rounded the corners to look a little bit more like playing cards. So I have my pieces ready for my figures here. I have the stuff for Glinda, or the die cuts for Glinda on the left there and for Elphaba on the right. And I'm going to assemble them both together. Each one of those die cuts are kind of in a pile for which character they're supposed to go in, but I'm going to do a few from one and then I'll do the same few from the other. So you'll see the characters come together at the same time. Now, my cardstock for Glinda is some Barely Peach for her face and her arms, and then most of the rest of her is die cut from Pink Sand cardstock, a little bit from some silver glitter cardstock for the accents. For her hair, I die cut it out of some Portobello cardstock. For Elphaba, all of the black pieces are die cut out of Onyx cardstock. Her skin, as well as the clubs, are die cut out of some Hero Arts Pesto cardstock. No, Hero Arts Kiwi cardstock. And then her hair is die cut out of some Latte cardstock. I have also a few pieces die cut out of Lunar Gray for her trim on her shirt or dress, as well as on the shield thing that goes on the right side of their bodies. Just to add a little bit of variation, I figured black on black you weren't going to see so much detail, but by adding those pieces of Lunar Gray, there's a little bit of a difference between some of the areas, and it just gives it a little bit more of an interesting look. So as I'm gluing these pieces together, again, you can see how quickly these characters come together. By being able to glue things with the liquid glue and shimmy them into place, I can then work on the next piece. It comes together so quick and easily. And I'm putting these characters on the same card, but it would be even fun to do them on completely separate cards and have two different cards with them. I think that would be a lot of fun as well. Because these characters are going on the same card, my card is going to end up being 5 by 7. They end up being a little bit too tall for a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card. So just keep in mind, if you do decide to do this, it's going to result in a larger card. You could also do like a slimline card if you wanted. However, doing a slimline card wouldn't work well with that Deluxe deck press plate background. So the 5 by 7 card works best when it comes to both of these characters at once, as well as having that press plate on the background. Now, for the majority of the characters for this card, I kept it with that Reversible Royal Court die set. The only thing that I added was the witch hat, and that is from the Booze Cocktails die set. And in the end, I think that's what makes Elphaba look like Elphaba. And then the only other thing I did was I die cut some initials out of the Be Bold uppercase alphabet die set. I thought it would be interesting to have a suit in the top left and the bottom right corner of the image, and on top of that suit have their initials. So rather than say King, Queen, or Jack or whatever, I thought it'd be interesting to have a G for Glinda and an E for Elphaba. So our characters are almost ready, just a few extra little pieces to glue on there. So we're gluing on the hands. And you can also see how the only difference between these two different pieces really is the color of die cuts, and you get a completely different look and the different vibe. And then obviously the crown and the witch hat. The rest of them are all the same pieces to it, just different colors. So you can get really creative with your die cuts and with the colors that you choose to die cut them. Now, the one thing that I forgot to mention earlier, for both the king for the card before this, as well as this one here, is behind the eyes. If you wanted their eyes to be a different color, you can just glue a piece of cardstock of whatever color you want them to be. I just let the piece of cardstock for the hair dictate what color their eyes were going to be. I didn't really have a preference for what I wanted them to be, so I thought that was just a good way to do it. But you could easily instead add a different color ahead of time before gluing the hair on if you wanted them to be a different color. So with those characters ready to go, I can trim down my sentiment here. So the sentiment I chose was I'm all in with you. I figured that worked best for the theme that I was going here. You could obviously choose a sentiment from a different press plate, stamp set, or whatnot if you wanted, or leave it without a sentiment. I wanted to have something from this collection for the sentiment, and that was the one that I chose that I figured worked best with it. So now that those pieces are ready to go, I can start figuring out the rest of my card. Now at this point, I hadn't really realized that these pieces were going to be too big for a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card. So this is where I'm trying to put it together, trying to see how I'm going to get it on to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch card, and realize that I just can't, especially with the size of the witch's hat. If you decide to do this with a different theme, you can definitely get it onto a smaller card if you want, or if you don't have a hat on there that adds that much extra length to it. While I'm processing this in my head, I'm just adding the suit to the corners of the cards. So I added a heart for Glinda, and I added the clubs for Elphaba. I chose the clubs simply because, to me, clubs, clover, green, it kind of worked. Again, it would really not matter which one you used. I just figured this worked best with it. And then I also have a suit die cut to put on their little shields, or whatever those things are called, that are on their right shoulders. I figured a suit on top of there would just kind of blend in and coordinate with the one in the corner of the card as well. So I am putting their arms in front of that shield piece for both sides. So both of them have the arms over the other's shield. I thought that looked a little bit more interesting. And off screen, I made a 5x7 card, and then I made a mat for this card that was 4.5 inches by 6.5 inches. Took the same corner rounded that I used before on the card piece and rounded those corners. Now for this mat, I want to have similar colors to what I did for my press plate background, but I want to have that black ink down there first. So I just put my image piece on top of it to kind of give myself a guide as to where I wanted my mat to end. And I'm doing some ink blending with that black soot distress ink on the bottom, making sure that I have everything that's going to be exposed covered. Now I am just putting my ink blending a little bit in from the card. Again, it doesn't need to be all the way in because we're not going to see the whole thing. I know that I'm going to have a wider black part at the bottom, so I wanted to make sure that it was up enough to be completely covered there. Before I go and put my pink champagne interference ink on there, I want to take my piece off my sticky mat, clean it off completely so that I don't get any black ink onto my ink blending brush for that pink champagne pad. I do as much as possible to try to not have cross-contamination there. I took that suit, that heart suit that I want to put on Glinda's shield, and I added some of that pink champagne interference ink on that. I wanted to have something on her tie into the pink on the background. I specifically chose to make sure that the pink of her outfit was not the exact pink as the background of the card, because I wanted her to pop off there and be able to be seen. I knew with Elphaba that she was going to be able to be seen because of that interference ink. It has a different look than the black cardstock. So I wanted to use a bit of a different color so that Glinda was also visible. But to tie that in, I have that pink champagne on the I'm All In With You sentiment, as well as the heart that's going to go on her shield. So it's all going to blend together beautifully. Now, the only thing that I didn't do that I could have done was put some of that interference ink on the lips of Glinda as well, and to tie that in a little bit, and then there would be a bit of a shimmer there as well. I just chose the pink sand cardstock, and I like the way it looks, but that's just another option. So once I have my figures here onto my card bases or my card background and the layers as well, I can glue those suits onto the little shield pieces, and then I'm ready to add the sentiment to the center of the card. And I'm lining that sentiment up with the angle line that is on the die cuts, as well as the angle line that's on the shading. Because there's a bunch of different layers of cardstock here though, I'm going to take a strip of that Hammermill cardstock and put a couple layers behind that sentiment just to build it up, make it raise a little bit, and it's going to be a little bit more stronger. So then when I glue it onto those different layers, it's not going to bend and buckle and be uneven, it's going to have a little bit more strength and be a little bit straighter. So I just put my glue on the back there, put that strip on there, and then use my detail scissors to trim off the excess. Once I have a few layers on there, I'm ready to go and I can glue that onto the front of the card. So that is one of the last details for the front of the card. Once that glue has completely dried, I am going to use some of those Crystal Mix gems to add some gems to the top of Galinda's crown. There are some circle dots at the top of there, so I'm using a few different sizes of the gems just to make it a little bit more interesting, and it also coordinates with the size of circle that are on those die cuts. It gives that crown just a little bit of extra sparkle. I mean, there's sparkle because of the glitter cardstock, but it just gives it a little bit of extra sparkle to it. The last step that I want to do is I want to have their eyes shining and glistening. So I'm just putting some dots of glossy accents on the areas for their eyes. If by chance you have any air bubbles in there, you do want to take a needle and poke those air bubbles out. If they dry in there, you're never going to get rid of them, but by poking them out, you can easily pop them. They're very easy to pop. Here is the finished card. Like I said before, it is a 5x7 card, and it's got some of the gorgeous shimmer from that interference ink on the background. On both the press plate as well as the ink-blended background, you see a lot of the black, but when you tilt it in the light, you get that green interference there that coordinates with the green from Alphabet Skin. Then we have our little king card here with the diamond background, and I love how interesting that diamond background looks. Then we have our lucky you card with those clubs or clovers on there. And then finally our heart card here. And I don't think I mentioned where the sentiment from this card is. It's from the Pooh and Friends collection. It's called Silly Old Bear Sentiments, and it works perfectly. It just worked better than the Shuffling Sentiments press plate from this collection. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.